us today. Today we'll be presenting on understanding the psychology behind design. You'll learn about how to make your presentations visually appealing and the psychology behind that. The webinar is hosted by the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. We are a national nonprofit that influences policy, mobilizes communities, and strengthens programs and organizations to improve the health of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. To learn more about the Health Forum, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping items. All participants will be muted throughout the webinar. To ask questions or make comments, please use our webinar menu, which contains a questions feature box. Please feel free to ask any questions throughout the webinar. We will be answering all of them at the end of today's presentation. We will also be posting the webinar on the Health Forum YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/APIAHF. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, AJ Titong. She is a runner, she's an ad junkie, and she's all about social media. Now I'd like to turn it over to AJ.
Hi everyone, it's good to have you back on our second webinar for the Data and Communications webinar series. So some learning objectives for today. I'm going to go over learning tricks on how to plan an effective presentation, understand how to apply color theory basics into your presentations, and I'm going to also throw in some typography in there since a lot of folks asked for it last week. And then we're going to learn the importance of layering in design. And then for today's agenda, I'll go over some principles of design, color theory and typography, layering, and the design process, which I think are all very important things to talk about when creating your data visuals, presentations, or even infographics. So let's get started. What is the psychology of design? That's a loaded question. There are many design principles out there to consider when creating a design, especially if you'll do a design with data in it. There's contrast, positioning, orientation, color, scale, shapes, quantity, dimension, linear, elements, tension, depth, typography, perspective, space, and repetition. There isn't enough time to go over all of this, but I'll touch on some key principles to help you get started. I share resources from sites and books that I enjoy, and today I'll share a lot from the Paperleaf blog and a design book called Layout Workbook from the publishing company Rockport. So let's get started. If anything, you'll need to learn the basic crap of design. That's right, I said crap. Crap as in contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. The reason why I chose this method is because in designing data visualization for your organizations or agencies, the things that will help make your design stick out the most are principles you think least about. I'm going to use crap a lot during this webinar, so don't associate with ugly design, but by contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. So let's get started with contrast. Contrast is a unique element in design and should stand apart from one another. What does that mean? If you're trying to tell a story with your data, everything shouldn't look the same. If you have multiple charts, make sure they stand out from one another through the type of chart you use. In the last webinar, Presenting Data to Tell a Story, Corina talked about how the top 3 chart styles focus on. Here she focuses on positioning, length, and then direction. Notice how each example on this slide vary in color, size, and shape. If anything, remember contrast is about differentiating between 2 different ideas or multiple ideas. The next idea is alignment. Many of you may know about basic alignment from creating Word documents. You have options to make your text left aligned, centered aligned, or right aligned. But this doesn't mean alignment is just horizontal. Alignment could also mean vertical alignment from top, centered vertically, or bottom vertical alignment. Alignment in data visualization is important because it plays into the hierarchy of how we read something. Who knows who this guy is? I like to think Johannes Gutenberg had a lot to do with why we read and look at things a certain way today. For those that don't know who he is, he's a big deal. He's the reason why we have books and printed materials today. He was the first to invent and use movable type printing. Without his innovations in type printing, we probably wouldn't be where we are in communications. Gutenberg and alignment. Depending on how you align your information, there is a natural flow of how readers engage and comprehend information they read. Here's an example. There are many patterns of layout out there. One example is a Gutenberg diagram. The Gutenberg diagram describes a general pattern the eye moves through when looking at evenly distributed information. The diagram divides the layout into 4 quadrants. So here it's 1, 2, and 3, and 4. The primary optical area, the strong follow area, the weak follow area, and then the terminal area. So here's an example of work that Corina and I did this year. You see that at the very top, where the primary optical area and the strong follow area, we place the title and description of the infographic. So here's the title, here's the description. Put it prominently at the top because of hierarchy. We did this because we want the audience to read this first as a way to learn about what to expect in the infographic. Then you move down into the 3rd and 4th quadrants. You begin to analyze the infographic. At this point, you're developing stories behind what you are reading. Take note, I didn't put any strong items or design elements in the weak follow area where the 3 appears. I did this because usually when you want to end your design first page, you want to end on something strong. So in this case, I ended design with a strong statistic about the issue I'm showing. Designs that follow the Gutenberg way are said to be in harmony with natural reading gravity, but don't feel like you have to follow this style of reading hierarchy. There's also the Z pattern. Other similar layouts include the Z pattern, which follows the same layout as the Gutenberg pattern, except a reader may jump from content to content, but will always start and end at the same place. What do I mean by this? So usually readers like to start at the beginning and they like to finish at the end. But sometimes the content in the middle, people don't read exactly word for word or look at items the way you see in the Gutenberg pattern. So here they could jump from one piece from one quadrant to the other quadrant, but they'll always start and finish at the same place. Another pattern is the golden triangle pattern. This triangular area at the top of the page, seen here 1, 2, and 3 in a triangular shape, will be the area most seen, and the pattern suggests most important information needs to be placed inside of it. So if you think about it, the first thing you see in a lot of publications is the title and then the information leading up or the introduction about what the content is about. Another popular pattern of layout design is the F pattern. As with the other patterns, the eye starts at the top left and moves horizontally to the right and then comes back to the left edge before making another horizontal sweep to the right. This second sweep won't extend as far as the first sweep. To learn more about these patterns, there is a great description from a design site called Vanzio Design. So again, the F pattern is you see the most content at the top, and the further you go down, the less content you'll take note of or the less you'll want to read, depending on how visually stimulating your design is. So the next CRAP principle is repetition. Repetition breeds cohesiveness in design and therefore creates consistency. Showing repetition can be done in a few different ways. These ways can also be associated with the branding of your organization. So here's an example of an infographic that Corina and I designed about a year or two ago. Have you ever looked at all of our Health Forum materials online? If not, you should really check them out because our staff works really hard to develop them. So anyways, this infographic, every time I develop a design, there are a few rules that I always stick to. One rule is typeface, title. The title is always in Century Gothic. Our body is always in Myriad Pro. I don't go over the two typefaces families for one simple reason, consistency and simplicity. These typefaces also align with our branding. So what I'm saying is I don't use Century Gothic, Myriad Pro, Calibri, Helvetica New all at the same time. I use only 2 of those typefaces at one time. But I'll go over more of the typography in the latter half of this webinar. Another thing that you will notice in is the use of colors. Red background for all of the headings and subheadings, yellow background for the description subheadings. You'll also notice that I repeat colors used in other sections. For example, the colors used to show population, here I think there is a mint, an orange, red, and a yellow, I use it to mirror in showing test sample for those populations. So here I talk about the populations in these bubbles, but when I go down to the next section of the infographic, I use the color and associate it with the people in the infographic. So there's a consistency in using color, and that is repetition. The next principle is proximity. Proximity allows for visual unity in a design. If two things are related to each other, they should be next to each other. I'm not talking about just images, but also images and how they relate to typefaces. Here's an example. Here's that infographic we like referring to that we found on good.is. Good.is is a great site that shows infographics on social and policy issues that are currently happening, so I do encourage you all to visit their site if you need ideas, or you were trying to pull new information. So if you look at this infographic, I can see easily that there's like a Gutenberg layout to it. But I also see how things are nicely grouped together based on context. So why is this important? When you group things together, it shows that the ideas belong together, and it also separates it so that you can read from one section to the next section. But this is what proximity means. You have the title, you have the description, and then you, in this area here, you see what factors relate to the infographic information that's in here. So each box in this slide kind of shows a different part of what this infographic is saying, but they all relate to each other. So the typefaces, the descriptions, the icons, the colors, they all relate to whatever the topic is. So, and they're all next to each other. So make sure when you're creating a design, everything that relates to one another should be in the same area or same location on your infographic. Before we move on to color and typography, I wanted to quickly show you other design elements to consider. Lines, shapes, value, color, texture, size, and shape. I think about these elements as you think about those principles. For example, how does the shape of my chart affect the alignment of my design? Or how does color create contrast in my design? Do all of these factors make for legibility and readability of my design? So let's jump into it. What is color theory? Basic color theory encompasses a multitude of definitions, concepts, and design applications. There can be a whole webinar series on color alone, so I'm going to just touch on the important aspects of color theory that I think would be helpful for you all. There are three basic categories of color theory that are logical and useful. The color wheel, color harmony, and the context of how colors are used. I'm going to go over a good chunk of how colors should be used, just because a lot of folks have been asking for that. Like, what do colors mean? When is it appropriate to use a certain color and whatnot? Color is a useful compositional factor that provides visual interest and emphasizes specific elements of the design. Don't forget the craft in design. Craft, as in contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Don't forget that. Colors play into each aspect of the craft design. What matters most in color theory is that you consider the tone of your project and use colors that complement or contrast the attitude of your design work. For example, red, you automatically think of heat, passion, or urgency. Do you notice how all of these have some kind of, it draws your eye and you instantly feel a certain emotion when you look at the color? And then when you look at the last slide I'm showing right now, urgency, notice how we associate signs with red color. Do you also notice how all of these signs stand out on a white background? Just looking at this makes me really nervous. And then there's blue. If you can name the scene that this slide is coming from, tweet me at AJ Titong, because it's pretty popular. Blue is cool. It's also quiet. See how that contrasts with red? Okay, so the next slide I'm going to go over basic colors. So yellow, it stimulates mental process. It also stimulates the nervous system, and it stimulates communication. Yellow is such a bright color that it's one of the happiest colors out there to use. So green. Green offers a sense of renewal, self-control, and harmony. Interesting fact, the solid green flag of Libya is currently the only national flag of a single color. And then there's purple. Purple uplifts, calms the mind and nerves, offers a sense of spirituality, and encourages creativity. Maybe that's why taro milk tea always makes me feel happy. And then there's pink. Pink encourages friendliness while discouraging aggression and ill will. Pink has been used in prison holding cells to effectively reduce erratic behavior. Isn't that crazy? And then there's orange. Orange offers some similar feelings that red inhibits. In fact, it represents activity, appetite stimulation, and socialization. Have you ever wondered why orange is used for prison uniforms? And then there's white. White aids mental clarity, encourages to clear clutter or obstacles, and enables fresh beginnings. Here's a tip. Ever hear about white space? The most effective way to bring visual attention to an image or area of your design is to isolate it with white space. White space does wonders. And I think people kind of abuse the idea of putting too much on a design. So think about how white space can actually be effective in your design area. The next one is the color gray. Gray is unsettling. It creates expectations. When you think of newspapers, that's kind of the feeling you get. You read the news, you don't know what to do with it, and then you want to know more about what's happening in the news. We're phasing out newspapers though, so I don't know how that'll change. Gray is also the perfect in-between to black and white. If you use black on top of white or vice versa, the contrast is too much, and you start to look at things and get dizzy. So gray would be like a great alternative to black or white. Also, gray reminds me of Eeyore when he's sad, which is all the time. So think about how the gloominess of gray can affect your design. And then lastly, black is my absolute favorite color because it goes with anything. Black is mysterious, shows weight. It's also associated with sophistication and power. If you take a look at the two cubes on the side, here's a tip. I know in the last webinar, Corina said to avoid the use of volume if you have more than one factor in a chart design. But if you're comparing two ideas, if you use the color black, it will show depth in the volume, whereas white shows emptiness and nothing. So imagine using, making an example of black and white and trying to show vast differences. The color, using these colors alone can make you feel something. So let's move on to typography. Many people ask me about what typefaces to use when designing a presentation or infographic. Earlier I mentioned that I have a design room where I don't use more than 2 or 3 type families. So here's an example. So maybe your next question is, well, how do you show craft in your design with only 2 typefaces? I'm going to show you this with one typeface, which is Century Gothic. So the first one is use all caps. You could use all caps for your title, your subtitle. You can use all caps to call out a description. You can use all caps to draw attention away from a certain design. The next one is use lowercase settings. I think some people freak out at the idea of using lowercase settings for a title in a design. But when you do it appropriately, using the ideas of craft design, you can totally get away with it. So check out this little poster on Century Gothic, how they're using the lowercase as a title face for the poster itself. And then the next one is mix your cases. I think they call it camel heading, where you capitalize each letter of the word. Use it to show differentiation between lowercase settings and then cap settings. And then, of course, bold settings. Bold typefaces can call attention to almost anything, especially if you combine it with regular typeface sets. And then lastly, there's italicizing. I like to think that italicizing text shows a subtle change. A lot of italicized text in a design is extra or miscellaneous kind of information. So think about citings, notes, or captioning things. One of the other big questions that I've gotten lately is how do you pick typefaces for your design? So 2 of the things that I always consider are legibility and readability. I remember being quizzed on this in art school, so try to commit this to memory. Legibility is how well you see the letters, and readability is how easily you can read the words, as in a long passage of a text. These 2, in essence, go hand in hand with one another. So let's learn a little bit about legibility. Choose typefaces with conventional letter forms. Over here you see two different typefaces, the TYPEFACE and the Saban. The TYPEFACE typeface is actually difficult to read, isn't it? But the Saban typeface makes for easy identification of each letter. So here I know what the O, the B, the S, the E, the Q, U, I, O, U, S is, but here I can barely identify what each of those letters are. Another thing is to choose typefaces with generous spacing. With the TYPEFACE typefaces, I don't see where a sentence starts or finishes, as opposed to the Saban, where the spaces between the words make for easy pauses when needed. So here I can see automatically there's a period, the sentence ends there, there's a comma here, there's a pause in that sentence. Here I could barely identify where those pauses and stops are. And then lastly, choose typefaces with a tall X height. What is an X height? X height is the height of a lowercase x, considered characteristic of given typeface of script. So here's an example of that. So let's go into readability. Choose a typeface that was designed for the purpose. So choose a typeface for display purposes. So if you choose a, basically if you choose a typeface for display purposes, maybe that typeface won't work out for the content or the body of your design. So if you notice here again, I use Century Gothic as a title, and then I use the Myriad Pro as a description text. So if the typeface doesn't look like it's something meant for body text, don't use it at all. You're going to probably confuse your readers or even stump them while they're trying to go through your design. And then there's this whole idea of alignment. Align your text to right rag for comfortability word spacing to avoid rivers. So I don't know if people know what rivers are, but if you look over here, this is a justified alignment. And what justification does on any word or copy document is it makes it even on both sides where the ledger is, and therefore creates these like weird spaces in between the body text that makes it a lot slower for someone who is reading or identifying your piece to go through. So try to avoid those rivers by sticking to the ragged right alignment. You see that here. And then also other things to consider. Consider the aesthetics. Is the design of the typeface appealing to you? Is it too structured for you? Is that what you want for your design? Is it structure that you're going for? Is it for pretty reasons? You want to grab someone's attention, be hip, or part of the trend. And then there's also mood. If you want to show that you're in a relaxed mood, your letters would probably be a little more spaced apart. Whereas if you're not in a relaxed mood, they're like constricted and tight like it is here. So, but make sure when you're picking out your typefaces that you always stick to considering legibility and readability. They should be your top priorities in choosing a typeface for a design meant for showing data, images, and text. Some great resources that I hope you all check out is Font Squirrel. I love this site because you can download different styles of typefaces. Some are free. A lot of them are free, actually. And you can actually type in what type of typefaces you want. So if it's sans serif or serif, they'll have a whole selection or category on it. Another typeface resource is font.com. Font.com is great because it shows you how to learn about using the use of typography, but it also shows you tips, suggestions, and inspiration on how you can use typefaces. And then we're getting closer to the end of our webinar, but I like to think about design as fashion. So layering. Basic design is like fashion. Think about it this way. We're rolling into the fall season and we have to start layering. Layering can protect you from being cold, showing you too much, or even accessorizing you. Keep this idea in mind when designing. So here is a basic background. There's nothing to it. It's a different color, has a little bit of a gradient to it, but nonetheless it's a different color aside from white or black. Here's the same background with a new shape included into it. I've added a display typeface to the background and the shape. So here I think you'll know where I'm getting at. But National Asian and Pacific Islander HIV/AIDS Awareness Day is the title of this infographic. And then I've continued adding more layers. I continue to use other shapes and other typefaces to create a subheading. And then I keep going. So here I include more shapes, different uses of typesettings, and then creating some kind of pattern to it. So I've included layering into this webinar because I think it's really important. Layering exists in all design software. So if you're an Adobe Creative Suite user, you will know how to use layers. But if you're using presentation, Microsoft Word, or PowerPoint, there are also ways of layering. So aspects of layering in design is creating a background, creating like an interface, and then putting the content on top of all of that. So here are the graphic layers that are separated. And then lastly is process. Process it honestly depends on like who you are, what organization you work for, and then things to consider. Do you have the resources to create data visualization or design in general? And then do you have a designer? And then do you have a clear understanding of what you want your designs to look like? So my design process, which I feel like is very general, I learned this in art school, but this is something that you practice all the time when you organize in general, but identify what your project is. While you're at that point, think about a problem and how you'll show a solution. Design is about problems and solutions. I think that's the easiest way to think about graphic design or data visualization. And then my next process is research. You really want to look into what your design is about. You want to make sure you have the right information. You want to make sure you have the right data. You want to make sure that your elements of the design match what those concepts and ideas are in your data. And this is a fun part. Well, sometimes it's agonizing, but I like to take a blank piece of paper and I just start sketching. You should just start sketching thumbnails of like what your design should look like. This is a great time to consider the craft of design. So consider how you're going to show contrast, consider how you're going to show repetition, alignment, and proximity in your design. So I would say, like, if you're creating an infographic, I would come up with 15 thumbnail sketches before you get onto the computer and start designing with whatever software you're using. Once you've done the sketches, then you should come up with some bit of a template of like what it should start looking like, and then start thinking about what mediums you want to use this design in. Are you going to use it on the computer? Is it going to be something that's used for reading online, or is it going to be printed, and where is it going to be printed? So think about what medium your design will be used in. And then, before you get to the final stage, it's the refining stage. So you've sketched it out, you have a template, you know what it's going to be used for. You're going to refine it now. How is it going to look? Finalize it, make sure the branding and consistency of the design are intact, and the design itself is harmonious to the eye. And then go. Think about a dissemination plan. How are you going to share it? Now that you know what the medium is and what the design looks like, use the different types of mediums to kind of go ahead and disseminate your information. So that's a sum up of all of the psychology behind design. Does anyone have any questions?
So our first question, what programs do you recommend for creating infographics?
I get this question a lot. Personally, I use the Adobe Creative Suite, so I use a lot of Illustrator and InDesign. But for some folks, you can actually use the Microsoft Suite. So if your organization doesn't have the funding or whatnot to buy design software, you can use PowerPoint or Word to do that. There are limitations, but the way you use your layering, how do you apply layering into your design should help you out a lot, just mastering how to layer, and then having the resources of the typefaces, what typefaces you want to use, and then the colors, and then integrating the branding. So honestly, you could use almost anything. Use what you have first and play with it, and if it doesn't work, then consider looking into programs that do work. I personally like the Adobe Suite.
Our next question is, when is it best to use justified formatting?
That's, I barely use justified formatting, actually. I feel like justified formatting, if you think about a paragraph and it's in justified formatting, when you read line by line, you don't know where to stop because there's no ragged edge. The reason why a lot of designers prefer the right ragged edge is because when a person's reading a document, you can see where the line stops. So if you think about Corina's length theory on charts, you can identify how long something is, and when the length plays in against each other, you can move on to the next line of reading, if that makes any sense.
Thank you, AJ. And I'd like to encourage anyone who has questions to use the questions feature box in their webinar menu. Now is a great time to tap into AJ's vast knowledge on design principles. And you can also contact AJ at ATITONG at APIAHF.org. You can also tweet at AJ using her Twitter handle at AJ Titong. It looks like we don't have any questions right now. I'll give a couple more seconds to see if there's any more questions. And until then, I do want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar on understanding the psychology behind design. For additional resources on design principles, please fill out our evaluation survey, which we will be sending out this week. You can also visit the Health Forum YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/APIAHF next week to watch a recording of this webinar. Looks like we don't have any more questions, so I want to thank you again and thank AJ for her great presentation. Please join us next week for the third and final part of the Data and Communications Webinar Series 2.0, putting your data out there and getting retweets, likes, shares, and comments next week on Tuesday, September 23rd. And here you can learn how to share your compelling data through social media. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. If you have questions, let us know.